Exposing the Expositions, Chapter 3A, narrated by author Howdy McCoskey. Planning and Building, Chicago. Starting in 1893, there were 9 major expositions in the U.S. Chicago 1893, Nashville 1897, Omaha 1898, Buffalo 1901, St. Louis 1904, Portland 1905, Jamestown 1907, Seattle 1909, and San Francisco 1915. I will examine the background of the expositions and the supposed magic construction of them. The cities themselves have magic building stories as well, and this too must be examined as much as the history of the expos as the cities as they were held in. Chicago's exposition of 1893 was a 690-acre site built supposedly from scratch in 2 years, which included all the planning, landscaping, construction of the buildings, all the canals dug, all the roads and sidewalks put in, all the midway rides up and running. What sort of planning does that require? Even if you claim to have 100,000 workers to do the job, Chicago claimed to use 40,000, who was setting up the feeding of them every day? Where did all the bathrooms go? How did the materials get to the site with no machines, trucks, or electrical power? That is 690 acres of not just buildings, but monster buildings. Look at the manufacturer's building in the center. By itself, it is 30 acres. How can you build this stuff so fast? I presented this question to my building contractor friend. Can the entire Columbia Exposition of 1893 be built in 2 years today? After studying the photos, his first response was a simple, no, not possible. Not possible, I asked back. Then he looked more closely at the hundreds of photos I showed him. Look, he said, it would take 2 years just to have the architectural and landscaping plans drawn up. This is a complex building project, and it has to be planned out properly. You can't just start throwing things up without having a good plan of where everything is going to be and why. How are those lakes going to be made, dug out, and set up to be sure there's no flooding? Then you need 2 years to do the landscaping and make the lakes and canals and roads. And I mean 2 years with modern equipment. Then you can get to the buildings. At least 10 more years for that. So 10 to 15 years with modern machines, I asked. Give or take, yeah. If I had 50,000 guys, all the machines I wanted, and an unlimited budget of hundreds of millions of dollars, then yeah, maybe 10 years, maybe a bit longer. Do you have any idea how this could have been done in 2 years between 1891 and 1893? Again, like I said, with the technology available at the time, it's just not possible. So for this to be true, this project equals the building of the pyramids in Egypt. That is not the story presented by historians for the Chicago Exposition, which the planning meetings are said to have been done in a month, and the entire exposition built and finished in less than 2 years, including losing time for severe winters. The story makes no sense. So what is that story, you ask? Well, this chapter is devoted to sharing not just the story of building the expositions, but the city of Chicago as well. Chicago's history. Yes, the building you're looking at is in Chicago, or it was in Chicago. That was the Federal Building, claimed to have been built between 1898 and 1905, just after the exposition ended. Talk of grandeur and amazement, this was it. And right away one would need to ask, just how was it built at the time? Because this was not a temporary structure. This was full of marble and stone columns and a giant dome. How many thousands of horses would be needed to move the shovels of dirt? How many tens of thousands of men digging and hauling stone? Why was something like that even needed? And a similar one needed in every city in the United States of that period. Of course, it survived only until 1966, when it was torn down to build the new Kluszewski Federal Building, which looks like a giant monolith from the 2001 Space Odyssey. Why? Of course, it would be easy to make this a simple case of comparing old world architecture to modern architecture. I want to be clear that buildings like the old Chicago Federal Building were in fact ancient art in stone. It holds the same principles of geometry, harmonic proportion, and energy creation that can be found at the Parthenon, Luxor Temple, or Chartres. Modern buildings do not. While I will present the difference between ancient and modern art at the end of this book, this chapter is a historical look at the origin of these cities, How fast they were built? Almost magically, looking like postcards of ancient Rome. Then the buildings either get burnt down in fires that do not at all seem like fires, or get demolished to build things like the Kluzneski building. A few of these old marvels continue on today, labeled as museum, university, or courthouse. But what survives is just a small portion of what was. The historical story of Chicago claims that the French explorers first came to the area in the late 1600s, finding only local Algonquin natives. A fort was built and a few log homes, but none of the wooden structures were said to make it through the War of 1812. It was only when the city was incorporated by big northern businessmen in 1837, due to the fact that the spot would be a central point on an east-west transport system, that the city really began. This historical presentation means that every building that has ever been built in Chicago must have only been built after 1837. By the time of the 1893 World's Fair, Chicago was a city of massive hotels, towers, domes, and Roman columns, all built supposedly in less than 60 years, which would be an amazing achievement if it were not for that most of the city was burned down in the Great Fire of 1871. But I will get to the fire shortly. For now, we're looking at the origin of Chicago and its Roman-like buildings. The name of Chicago itself is the first problem I have with the city's history. The standard historical claim is that this was a French rendering of a Native American word, Chikawa, a type of onion. The place name Chicago was found in a memoir by Robert de La Salle in 1679, while Henry Joutel's journal of 1688 noted that the wild garlic called Chicago grew abundantly in the area. Supposedly, this was a native village, because this place provided a fairly short portage between Lake Michigan and the Mississippi River system. So that is the story. Native settlement with a name derived from a type of onion, and no building until whites take total control in 1837. However, early maps tell a different story. One of the greatest tools for the revisionist historian is ancient maps, because they show the level of detail and perfection in most cases that they're not supposed to have, for they were often based on much older maps from perhaps as far as ancient Egypt, kept in secure areas such as the Vatican. There are discrepancies on these maps, generally presented as mistakes that the early map makers are supposed to make because they just were not wise enough to know the world they were mapping. That's the standard historical question. But they got most of the map perfect, leading the question about the areas that today are in question. Other maps, such as the first world map of 1587 by Urbano Monte, depict what can only be called cities with Italian names all across North America. I don't think he would have just popped down a bunch of native Indian villages on such a map, for they have similar markings and symbols to those cities in continental Europe. It was more likely that when he was making the map, information of what was in North America was well known at the time, and as such was placed on this very accurate early map. And the name of a large settlement known as Chicago is right where you would expect Chicago to be today. Some maps, such as the 1596 Debray map, show the name Chilaga, where Chicago should be. Even today, Chilaga is thought by historians to be a mythical place, like Camelot, like the mythological Troy, which only became a real place. Perhaps Chilaga is real too. This drawing is supposed to show a time before any major building had begun, in 1632, when there was a population of 2,000. Interesting, you can see that the drawing was made in 1892, right at the time that they were building the World's Fair. How convenient. This is a good example of how history might possibly be just made up, that the World's Fair wanted an historical story, and so such drawings were created to provide it. Another image is of Chicago in 1853. That is a massive amount of building in less than 20 years. I'm counting 5 major towers similar to cathedrals, several smaller ones, and a round tower building. How was all of this built in just 20 years from a population of 2,000? Where did they get the building materials from? How did the materials get in with only dirt roads to move on what would be massive amounts of stone and brick? I can say stone and brick as photos coming up from an 1858 panorama of the city show the downtown and almost no wood buildings at all. The fire story gets harder to explain. Brick and stone is a much longer building process, and this size cannot just be built up in 20 years. But that's not the real strange part. How about the story that they lifted? Yes, lifted up all of the buildings from street level during the next 10 years. The history basically states that Chicago was built on a swamp and had poor drainage, for it had no high ground compared to the lake edge. The poor drainage led to standing water, which created epidemics of typhoid, dysentery, and cholera. A quote from Paul Johnson in The History of the American People. The city was built on a low-lying area subject to flooding. In 1856, the city council decided that the entire city should be elevated 4 to 5 feet by using a new available jacking up process. In one instance, the 5-story Briggs building, weighing 22,000 tons, was lifted while it continued to operate. Johnson reminded that such a feat could not have happened in Europe and wrote, "This astounding feat was a dramatic example of American determination and ingenuity based on the conviction that anything material is possible." This is the presentation of the same story in Wikipedia. In January 1858, the first masonry building in Chicago is thus to be raised. A 4-story, 70-foot-long, 750-ton brick structure situated at the northeast corner of Randolph Street and Dearborn Street was lifted on 200 jack screws to its new grade, which was 6 feet 2 inches higher than the old one, without the slightest injury to the building. Before the year was out, they were lifting brick buildings more than 100 feet long. But this is just a warm-up. In 1860, they raised up half a city block on Lake Street between Clark Street and LaSalle Street. A solid masonry row of shops, offices, printers, etc., 320 feet long, comprising brick and stone buildings some 4 stories high, some 5, having a footprint taking up almost 1 acre of space and an estimate, all in weight, including hanging sidewalks, of 35,000 tons. Businesses operating out of these premises were not closed down during the lifting. As the buildings were being raised, people came, went, shopped, and worked in them as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. In 5 days, the entire assembly was lifted 4 feet 8 inches in the air by a team consisting of 600 men using 6,000 jack screws, ready for new foundation walls to be built underneath. The spectacle drew crowds of thousands who were on the final day permitted to walk on the old ground level among the jacks. End quote. Basically, the claim is that the whole of downtown, the streets, sidewalks, and buildings, were raised on hydraulic jacks or jack screws, while the people were living and working in the buildings. Think of that. Not even send them away for a few days. Oh no, just let them walk up and down 5 flights of stairs while the building's being lifted up. That is how ludicrous the story is. Bancroft describes the raising as, "This work was in truth a necessity, in order to provide a thorough system of sewerage and to avoid the malarial fevers and the other forms of sickness caused by the low swampy site, a site which for years after Chicago had become a thriving commercial town was little better than a quagmire, and where, as one of her citizens remarked, the one unequaled, universal, inevitable, inconceivable thing about the place was mud," my reference. To accomplish this task, the streets were filled in, and by means of jack screws, worked by steam power, not only the largest dwellings, but the largest business buildings and business blocks, together with churches, theaters, hotels, and edifices of every kind, were raised to the required elevation, and then, without being vacated, whether used for business or residential purposes. End quote. Then, the workers diverted the entire river system by an extraordinary feat of engineering that was made to change its course, its southern branch being connected at a distance of 2.5 miles from the lakefront with the Illinois and Michigan Canal, which had also been so deepened to draw the waters of the lake. Okay, either this is a work that rivals building the Giza pyramids, or this is just a giant fairy tale. I don't see an in-between with this. First, to build an entire city on a swamp, with giant buildings that would require massive foundations, only to realize, oh gee, we're on a swamp, we better raise them all up. So then raise all the buildings, and in fact the streets as well, divert the river, and build new canals. Did anyone really believe this? Think of trying to do that today. It would be a major undertaking that might not even be possible with all of our modern machinery. Yet Chicago could do this in 1858. Again, go ask your local building contractor to, say, lift a small city, like South Bend, Indiana, population 100,000. See what they tell you from what? Do you have 50 years and $2 billion? Besides, I have only found 2 photographs of this work being done. Mostly all that exists of it are poorly made drawings. They had photography this time. There are lots of photographs from the 1850s available. Floods in California and Civil War dead, and many other average things were photographed. Would not something like this, something that had never been attempted in human history, not warrant interest for a couple of photographs? One of the only photographs I found was here at this particular footnote. As you can see, it's basically the same view as the drawing presented on the previous page. The drawing may in fact have been created directly from the photo, yet they are totally dissimilar. The drawing has made it out like hundreds of jacks are lifting the building off a very flat and level ground street. But in the original photograph, I see nothing being raised and no jacks. Instead, what seems to be the building dug out, and they're trying to lay a foundation of some type beneath it. What can only be described as a pile of dirt is next to it, but that could also have been a sinkhole now filled in, and that they tried to keep the building from falling into. One more strange mention on this topic. There is a suggestion that a specific engineer, John C. Lane, was a key element in making this work. He was supposed to have learned this building lifting technique in San Francisco in 1853. What? As we will see further on, San Francisco should have just been founded in 1847. There should be a few gold miners and cowboys there, and a few simple shacks to accommodate them. What buildings are there that would need to be raised? There should be no buildings there at all. But some standard historical sources do claim there were buildings there long before 1847, and quite spectacular ones. When one views the 8 photographic parts that make up a panorama of Chicago, taken from the dome of the courthouse in 1858, things get more confusing. Wooden buildings is the claim for why the city burnt so easily in the 1871 fire. Yet I see almost all brick and stone, just what we would find in the aftermath of the fire photos. Secondly, note that this entire area, along with the 8 other photos, is supposed to have been raised 10 feet during this period. I hope it's beginning to be seen just how crazy this idea of raising the city is when one specifically views what is supposed to have been lifted up. A few paragraphs ago, I made emphasis on one word of Bancroft's book, mud. This is a throwaway line in Bancroft's writing, but it may have been a direct reflection that the city was covered in mud. There is a group of current researchers of something called the mud flood. They have a theory that a worldwide burying of cities in mud during the period 17 to 1800s. Mud flood will be defined fully in the final chapter. But to me, it is more likely that if work was going on in the 1850s, that Chicago was not using a workforce to raise the buildings from a swamp, but rather to dig it out of what might have been a river of mud that buried much of it. No matter. The story of raising all the buildings of Chicago is covering up something, no pun intended. And that again is why the examination of the World Fairs is so important. Something is very wrong with our history of this period of time, and every part of it that we can uncover might finally take us to the next step to knowing what really happened to the world.